Okay, so I'll kind of go through these pretty quickly, and what I want to do here is just highlight a few issues that we think are important when you're surveying the literature and trying to figure out what it is that the Center for Tobacco Products and the regulators at FDA would find to be important, and things that they are saying that they're interested in. One has to do with the basis for comparison. So when we're looking or thinking about vapor effects on something, very often studies don't include what I would call what I would deem to be the most important two comparisons. One would be the negative control, which is, breathing air, for example, versus cigarettes. And in my opinion, you really need those two bookmarks to be able to place assessment of risk on the continuum. So do say in this case emissions from electronic cigarettes, do they look more like emissions compared to cigarette smoke versus something less? What we're beginning to see now are actually more and more studies, although still not many, looking at actually longitudinal changes in exposure as a function of whether people switch off of regular cigarettes. And actually, Machi's the first author on this paper. He'll be able to tell you much more about this. But the point is that there is evidence, increasing evidence that if people switch off of cigarettes and manage to switch at least significantly so, if not completely, there are notable reductions in exposure to various toxicants. This is another recent study that Machi also happens to be on. I think this came out last week, 2 weeks ago, something like that. And this one's worth paying attention to because the comparisons here are with smokers who are using cigarettes and e-cigarettes, using cigarettes and nicotine replacement therapy versus former smokers in each of those two groups. And without going into detail here, it's apparent, at least to me, that what's driving toxicant exposure in so-called dual use, people who are using both products, is driven primarily by use and intensity of combustible tobacco products. Okay? So that's the driving force behind what you're seeing in these patterns of exposure to toxicants. And in fact, the PATH study, which I think was mentioned earlier today, has much more information on these kinds of exposures, these kinds of subgroups. I'm not at liberty, and nor is Machi, who's on the PATH study, to be able to say anything about the results. However, the PATH study is funded by the FDA, Center for Tobacco Products, so I'm wondering if the committee at some point might be able to ask the FDA if they can peek at some of the data. But that you can say that I said that, but it's really up to them. Okay. So what are the concerns in terms of dual use? The first is what I was talking about, which is that somehow the state of smoking and using these ENDS products might in fact increase toxic levels of various compounds compared to use of either product alone. And again, I don't think that we're seeing that that's the case unless there's extreme continued use of combustible products in addition to using the e-cigarette products. If people drop down on their use of combustible products, you'll also see the biomarkers of harm drop down. The other concern is more behavioral, and I won't get into that too much, but the issue there is that people may get stuck in a dual-use state for a very long period of time, which may not be very good for them. So in other words, it may discourage quitting. We actually know very, very little about that phenomenon, extremely little. And part of the reason for that, and I'll show you this in a second, is because we really do not have very good longitudinal data about how long people stay in one state, stay in a dual state, how long it takes them to move in and out of these various states. The other point I want to make is that the exposure to toxins is highly, highly device and user specific. There's a paper that I just accepted in PLOS One last week, should be coming out in the next week or two online. Very good demonstration of device specificity. They were looking at benzene emissions. One device had 0 non-detectable levels, another 2 devices had detectable levels that were entirely dependent on how people use them. In other words, the wattage level and how high they drove the wattage of these devices. Now, this slide, you don't need to get into the details of it, but these are possible states of tobacco product use. At the top, you have N for never, C is combustible, CNC is combustible and non-combustible, ENS products, for example. NC, non-combustible, that could be ENS products, and S is for stopping. And you can see that with just 3 time points, there are a huge number of possible trajectories for people. So when we're looking at a snapshot at 1 time point in time, or even 2, we're not really doing justice to the potential complexity of use of these products over time. And that's just something to keep in mind when you're reviewing these studies. Adverse events, I won't spend too much time on this except to say that the poison control centers are keeping track of adverse events related to exposure to e-liquids, some products themselves that are mostly have to do with the explosions and fires and things like that. But in aggregate, adverse event reporting related to ENS devices pales in comparison to actually exposure to regular tobacco products, cigarettes, cigars. Kids eat these things, and even to some degree nicotine replacement products. Smoking cessation, not a lot of good clinical data, clinical trial data, as you probably know. There's more on the way, there's more in the pipeline. The NIDA has just released a request for applications to do clinical studies with a standardized device that they commissioned to be produced, and they're accepting applications. Applications are due April 24th for anybody who's thinking about applying. But we need many more of these studies. However, there's a huge number of studies that are, observational studies that have their own sets of problems in terms of interpretability and so forth. So again, it's important to look at those observational studies with a critical eye to all of the numerous confounders that could play around with results going in one way or another. Vulnerable populations, there really hasn't been too much work done with vulnerable populations, and in particular people with medical comorbidities. So this is an area that I think should be of great interest, and one reason is because this is where we may perhaps see the potential benefits of using these devices play out. So this is a study by Ricardo Pelosa where he was looking at patients with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. On the left of the slide is the number of cigarettes smoked per day, and basically divided up into 2 groups, those who stayed the same and those who managed to switch either completely or almost completely to e-cigarette devices. And then on the right of the slide, you see exacerbations of severe COPD, and you can see some potential benefit over time in the group of people who actually switch to these devices more or less successfully. So this is not a definitive study, but this is just an example of what I think are important kinds of studies for people to pay attention to. Are we seeing benefits, potential benefits of using these devices in the patients who are most vulnerable and already suffering from extensive smoking-related diseases and illnesses. Health effects in ENS non-users, so this really has to do with more, secondhand exposure issues. Again, in my opinion, not a lot of good studies in this area, certainly worth looking at, but also very tricky to look at because whatever is in the emissions from e-cigarettes doesn't tend to hang around very long compared to, say, cigarette smoke. So it's very hard to study the, actual exposure issues, at least in, quasi-natural, natural environments. So these are just a few little points, everything I said basically. And finally, as Allison showed, I mean, the studies are coming out like every day. And it's a huge pain to even keep up with it. I mean, this was a huge effort to just keep after this stuff. And oh, by the way, we're happy to share all of this information with the committee. And it really is, driven by limited resource capacity. We're fortunate at the Schroeder Institute to be able to focus on work like this. A couple of other points, huge heterogeneity in study design across the board, so that's a big issue to grapple with, and try to figure out which are some of the better designs, and a lot of variability in study quality. And a big example of that is when you look at the behavioral studies. By far, most of them are cross-sectional in nature, and these kinds of designs are just severely limited in terms of the kinds of inferences you can make. There are more longitudinal studies coming out, but there's still only a handful of these. And the PATH study again will be able to add to that knowledge, but you're going to have to ask the FDA to take a look at the data. Thank you.